Did you hear that news about ransomware exploiting AWS S3? Turns out, even the cloud isn't as safe as we thought.
Yeah, it's pretty scary stuff.
Okay, so for this deep dive, you shared a bunch of articles and forum discussions about ransomware hitting S3 buckets.
Mm-hmm.
You even included some internal notes on AWS security best practices.
Yeah.
It seems you're looking for a clear breakdown of how these attacks work and, more importantly, what practical steps you can take to protect your own data.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's unpack this whole S3 ransomware situation. First things first, S3, or Simple Storage Service.
Right.
It's basically cloud storage on demand from Amazon Web Services. It's incredibly popular because of its scalability and durability. We're talking 11 nines of durability. That means your data is practically guaranteed to be safe from hardware failures.
Right, right.
But as those news stories highlight, that doesn't mean your data is automatically safe from everything. Yeah. Especially from cyber threats like ransomware.
Definitely not. No.
What's fascinating here is that the very features designed to make S3 so durable can actually be weaponized by attackers.
Right.
They can use these features against you, essentially locking you out of your own data.
Yeah.
So let's walk through how a typical S3 ransomware attack might play out.
Okay.
It all starts with those IAM credentials,
Mm-hmm.
the keys to your cloud kingdom, so to speak.
Right, yeah.
Attackers will often target these credentials through phishing scams or brute force attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Once they have those credentials, they can wreak havoc. For example, they might use a feature called server-side encryption with customer-provided keys. Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
They get in, encrypt your data with their keys,
Right.
and suddenly you're locked out. And to make matters worse, they could disable versioning or delete past file versions, essentially wiping out any potential backups you might have had.
Yeah, and then you're really in trouble.
At that point, the attackers have you over a barrel. They demand a ransom, usually in cryptocurrency, in exchange for restoring access to your data.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
And to add insult to injury, recovering from a ransomware attack in the cloud can be even more complex than dealing with a traditional system.
Yeah, definitely.
It all hinges on what you had set up beforehand. If you didn't have the right safeguards in place, like versioning or replication, you're in for a world of pain and expense.
Right. Yeah, it's all about being prepared.
Here's where that crucial distinction between durability and security comes into play.
Right.
Relying on S3's durability alone is like thinking you don't need car insurance just because your car has airbags. Airbags are great for accidents, but they won't protect you from theft, vandalism, or, well, ransomware.
Exactly. It's a good analogy.
You need more than just airbags. You need a comprehensive safety net, and that's where security measures and robust backup strategies come in.
Definitely.
Speaking of backups, one of the forum posts you shared included this gem. Backups are like seatbelts. You don't need them every day, but when you do, they can save your life. And nowhere is that truer than in the world of ransomware.
Absolutely.
Now, the good news is that AWS offers a whole arsenal of tools and features to help you protect your S3 data. But before we dive into those specifics, let's talk about the three pillars of a solid backup strategy: regularity, immutability, and accessibility.
Okay.
What do we mean by regularity? It means automating your backups so you're not relying on manual processes or human memory. It's about consistency and making sure backups happen like clockwork.
Right.
Immutability is all about making those backups tamper-proof. You want to make absolutely sure that no one, including attackers, can modify or delete your backups. This ensures that you always have a clean, reliable copy of your data to restore from no matter what.
Right. Yeah, that's super important.
And finally, accessibility. This is about where you store your backups. Don't keep them in the same AWS account as your primary data. If that main account gets compromised, your backups could be vulnerable too. Ideally, you want to store your backups in a completely separate AWS account, or even consider using a different cloud provider entirely. That way you have true separation and redundancy. So those are the foundational elements of a solid backup strategy. Now let's move on to the specific features and tools that AWS provides to help you implement these strategies and protect your S3 buckets.
Oh.
First up, and this is a big one, versioning. Versioning allows you to keep multiple versions of your objects within an S3 bucket. If a file gets overwritten or deleted, you can just revert back to a previous version. It's like having an undo button for your data.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Even if an attacker manages to encrypt or delete your files, you'll have a way to recover. It's a simple but incredibly powerful safeguard, your first line of defense in the fight against ransomware. And enabling it is relatively straightforward and cost-effective, especially when you consider the peace of mind it provides.
Hmm.
Now, to add an extra layer of protection to your versioning setup, there's a feature called MFA Delete. MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is like that extra code you get from your phone when logging into certain accounts. MFA Delete requires this extra authentication step for critical actions like, well, deleting versions of objects.
Right.
So even if someone gets their hands on your IAM credentials, they still can't just wipe out your backups without jumping through that extra hoop. It makes it significantly harder for them to cause truly irreversible damage.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so we have versioning and MFA delete. But what about disaster recovery? What if an entire AWS region goes down? That's where cross-region replication, or CRR, comes into the picture. CRR creates a copy of your bucket in another AWS region. Think of it as an insurance policy for your data. If one region goes down, your data is safe and sound in another location. You're essentially protected against major outages or even region-specific attacks.
Right.
And setting it up is surprisingly straightforward. You just choose a destination region, tweak some settings, and AWS handles the rest. Now, let's go back to IAM policies for a moment. Remember how we talked about attackers targeting those all-important IAM credentials? Well, this is where you can really lock things down and minimize the damage they can do if they manage to get in. IAM policies control who has access to your AWS resources, including your precious S3 buckets. The key here is to embrace the principle of least privilege. That means only granting access to those who absolutely need it, and even then, giving them the minimum level of permissions required to do their job. No more giving everyone admin access just in case. That's a recipe for disaster. You need to be very deliberate and restrictive with your permissions, regularly audit your policies to ensure they're not overly permissive, and revoke access for any unused accounts. It's all about limiting the blast radius of a potential attack.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Now, for those crown jewels of your data, the super important can't-be-touched files, you might want to consider using S3 Object Lock. Object Lock basically puts data in a write-once-read-many mode. No modifications, no deletions, nothing. It makes your data essentially untouchable.
Wow.
This is especially useful for data that needs to be preserved for compliance reasons or anything that absolutely cannot be tampered with. But even with all these preventative measures, you can't just set them and forget them. You need to actively keep an eye on things, and that's where AWS's monitoring tools come into play. Think of CloudTrail as a security camera for your cloud. It logs all API activity in your AWS environment. If something fishy is going on, CloudTrail will likely have a record of it. You can track down unauthorized access attempts or suspicious changes. And then there's Guard Duty, your intelligent security guard in the cloud. It analyzes your account activity and looks for those telltale signs of a potential threat. Think sudden spikes in delete requests or any unusual activity patterns. Guard Duty is trained to spot these anomalies and alert you so you can investigate and take action. Now, even with all these layers of protection, it's crucial to remember that security is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
Right.
The threat landscape is constantly evolving. What works today might not be enough tomorrow. So you need to stay informed and adapt your strategies accordingly. It's not enough to just set up your defenses and then forget about them. You need to be vigilant and proactive. Make security a part of your company culture. Encourage your team to stay up to date on the latest threats and best practices. Share those news stories about ransomware attacks with your team to raise awareness and keep everyone on their toes. Remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about these threats, the better equipped you'll be to protect your data and your organization.
I couldn't agree more.
So stay curious, stay informed, and never underestimate the importance of security, especially when it comes to your S3 buckets. Now, before we move on to some specific case studies and real-world examples of S3 ransomware attacks, let's take a moment to reflect. We've talked about the technical aspects of S3 security, but what are the broader implications of these threats? How can we shift our mindset to be more security conscious in this increasingly cloud-dependent world?
Yeah, that's a good point.
This is where we need to move beyond the idea that security is solely the responsibility of the IT department. It's everyone's responsibility, from the top down. We need to cultivate a culture of security awareness within our organizations. That means educating employees about the risks, empowering them to make smart security decisions, and fostering a culture where security is seen as an asset, not a burden. We need to build trust and open communication so that people feel comfortable reporting potential security issues without fear of blame. This shift in mindset is crucial because the reality is that cyber threats are not going away anytime soon. In fact, they're only going to become more sophisticated and more pervasive. So we need to be prepared to adapt and evolve our security strategies constantly. Now, on that note, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll delve into some fascinating case studies of S3 ransomware attacks. These real-world examples will highlight the very real consequences of these threats and reinforce the importance of the strategies we've discussed today. Stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork talking about how those attacks unfold and why just relying on S3's durability isn't enough. Now let's bring this to life with some real-world examples that you've shared in the source material.
That's a great idea because nothing drives home the importance of S3 security quite like seeing how these attacks play out in the real world.
Exactly. So let's dive into a case that really shows why this stuff matters.
Okay, picture this. There was this media company that stored all their footage in S3. Raw footage edits, final cuts, everything.
Makes sense. Cloud storage is practically the industry standard these days, especially for media companies dealing with massive files.
Right, but they made a critical mistake. They didn't enable versioning. And one day, an employee accidentally deleted an entire folder containing weeks' worth of work for a major project.
Ouch. I can feel the collective gasp of every video editor out there. That's a nightmare scenario.
It was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from because without versioning, that data was gone. Poof. Just like that. They couldn't recover, the files, deadlines were missed, and the whole project was thrown into chaos.
A stark reminder that human error is a real threat, and we're all human. Even the best of us.
Exactly, and it highlights why those backups are so crucial. They're like a safety net for those inevitable moments when something goes wrong.
Okay, so that's human error. But what about straight-up malicious attacks? Got any examples of those?
Plenty, unfortunately. There was this tech company, for example, that seemed to have everything locked down, encryption MFA, the whole 9 yards.
They were doing everything by the book, it sounds like.
From the outside, yes. But they had a vulnerability. They overlooked overly permissive IAM policies. And an attacker managed to exploit this, gaining access not just to one S3 bucket, but several.
That doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. The attacker went on to encrypt all the data in those buckets using their own keys, effectively holding the company's data hostage.
And because they had access to multiple buckets, the impact was even greater.
Yeah.
A real domino effect.
Exactly. And suddenly, this company was faced with a crippling decision to pay a hefty ransom or potentially lose years' worth of sensitive data.
Wow, these stories are making me sweat a little. It really highlights how crucial those IAM policies are. Least privilege is not just a suggestion, it's a necessity.
Couldn't agree more. And this case also shows why you need to regularly audit those policies. Make sure there are no lingering permissions that could be exploited. You can't just set them and forget them.
Okay, so we've got accidental deletion and malicious encryption. What other kinds of havoc can attackers wreak?
Well, there's this case that really illustrates the importance of securing not just your data, but also your replication settings. This biotech startup was storing all their research data in S3 clinical trial data experimental results. It works.
High-stakes stuff.
Absolutely. And they thought they were protected because they had enabled cross-region replication. So even if one AWS region went down, their data would be safe in another.
That seems like a solid strategy.
It is, but these attackers were crafty. They didn't just encrypt the data, they targeted the replication settings themselves.
Yeah, they could actually do that.
Yep. They modified the replication rules to create a loop constantly overwriting the backup data with the encrypted version. So even though the data was being replicated to another region, it was essentially being replicated with corrupted data. It was a devastating blow to their disaster recovery plan.
Wow, that's really devious. So even with replication in place, you're not completely off the hook. You need to secure those replication settings themselves.
Absolutely. It's about understanding those potential attack vectors and closing those gaps. It's like playing a game of chess. You need to be constantly thinking several moves ahead, anticipating your opponent's next move.
Okay, so these examples really drive home the point that S3 security is not something to take lightly. What happened to these companies, by the way? Did they pay the ransom?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure, as companies often keep that information confidential, understandably. But it's a tough position to be in. There are no easy answers.
No easy answers indeed. It really underscores the need to be prepared. It's not just about preventing attacks, but also having a solid plan in place in case one does happen.
Exactly. Think of it as a three-pronged approach: prevention, detection, and recovery.
Prevention being all those measures we talked about earlier, versioning MFA IAM policies, backups, and so on.
Right. Detection is all about using tools like CloudTrail and GuardDuty to spot those red flags. Any suspicious activity that might indicate an attack is underway. It's about catching things early before they escalate.
And recovery is about having those backups ready to go, making sure you can actually restore your data from them quickly and efficiently, ideally, without having to cave in to ransom demands.
Exactly. And the more layers of protection you have in place, the more robust your prevention, detection, and recovery strategies, the better your chances of weathering the storm if, or rather, when an attack occurs.
All right, so we've really dug into ransomware attacks, but let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of S3 security. What other threats are lurking out there besides ransomware?
That's a good point. While ransomware grabs the headlines, there's a whole spectrum of threats that could compromise your S3 buckets.
Okay, so what else should we be aware of?
Well, one of the biggest threats, and ironically one of the most overlooked, is misconfiguration.
Misconfiguration, you mean like setting things up incorrectly?
Precisely.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how often S3 buckets are left publicly accessible due to simple misconfigurations.
Wait, so anyone on the internet could potentially stumble upon sensitive data just because someone didn't tick the right box or something?
It's unfortunately more common than you might think. And it can have serious consequences. There have been cases where massive amounts of data were leaked or stolen because of misconfigured S3 buckets.
So it's not always about sophisticated hackers breaking in. Sometimes it's just a simple oversight that leaves the door wide open.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to double check your settings, really understand the implications of each configuration option, and stick to those best practices like the principle of least privilege.
Okay, so misconfiguration, definitely something to watch out for. What other threats are out there?
Another growing threat is malware.
Malware, like viruses and things like that. I thought that was more of a concern for traditional computers, not cloud storage.
It used to be, but attackers are constantly innovating. We're seeing a rise in malware specifically designed to target cloud environments, including S3.
How does that even work? I mean, it's not like you're downloading and running files directly from S3, right?
True, but remember S3 is often used to store application code scripts and other files that are eventually executed in some way.
Okay, so if an attacker can inject malicious code into those files.
Exactly. They could potentially take control of servers, steal data, or cause all sorts of mayhem.
That's a sobering thought. How can we protect ourselves from this kind of attack?
It comes back to layering your defenses. Use anti-malware software, scan your files before uploading them to S3, and be very careful about the sources of your code and scripts.
So it's about being cautious and not just blindly trusting anything you download or upload to the cloud.
Right. And don't forget to keep your systems and software updated with the latest security patches. Those patches often contain fixes for known vulnerabilities that could be exploited by malware.
Okay, so misconfiguration and malware. Anything else we should have on our S3 security radar?
Insider threats are another important consideration.
Insider threats. You mean disgruntled employees or something like that?
That's one possibility, but it could also be unintentional. An employee might accidentally expose sensitive data or make a configuration change that unintentionally weakens security.
So it's not always about malicious intent. It could just be carelessness or a lack of awareness.
Precisely. That's why it's so important to have strong security policies in place, to provide regular security awareness training to your employees, and to closely monitor user activity.
It all circles back to building that culture of security awareness that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Everyone within an organization has a role to play in protecting sensitive data.
Okay, so we've got misconfiguration, malware, and insider threats. Any other S3 security challenges we should be aware of?
Yes, there's one that often flies under the radar: data integrity.
Data integrity. What exactly does that mean in this context?
It means making sure your data stays accurate and unaltered throughout its life cycle, protecting it from accidental or intentional modification or corruption.
Okay, so it's not just about preventing unauthorized access or deletion. It's about making sure the data itself remains reliable and trustworthy.
Exactly. And this becomes especially critical for sensitive data like financial records, medical records, or anything that needs to be auditable and verifiable.
So how do we ensure data integrity in S3? What are some practical steps we can take?
One strategy is to use checksums.
Checksums. Refresh my memory on what those are again.
A checksum is basically a unique fingerprint of a file, a string of characters that acts as a digital signature. You calculate a checksum before uploading a file to S3 and then calculate it again after downloading the file. If those checksums match, you can be confident that the file hasn't been tampered with.
That's a clever way to verify the integrity of the data.
It is, and AWS offers built-in tools that can help automate this process.
That's great. Are there any other methods for ensuring data integrity in S3?
Versioning, which we talked about earlier, also plays a key role in data integrity.
Okay, remind me how versioning ties into data integrity.
Well, with versioning enabled, you have a complete history of all the changes made to your S3 objects. So if data is accidentally or maliciously modified, you can always revert back to a previous version, essentially undoing any unauthorized changes.
So it acts as a sort of audit trail for your data,
Mhm.
allowing you to track down any unauthorized modifications and restore the data to its previous state.
Exactly. And this can be incredibly valuable for compliance purposes because you can demonstrate that your data has been properly protected and hasn't been tampered with.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So checksums and versioning are essential tools in the data integrity toolbox. Anything else we should keep in mind?
Yes, it's also important to consider data retention policies.
Data retention policies, what are those all about?
They are basically rules that dictate how long you need to keep certain types of data. You might be legally or contractually required to keep certain data for a specific number of years, for example.
Right. It's not always up to us to decide when we can delete data.
Exactly. And S3 has tools that can help you automate data retention, such as lifecycle policies. You can set up a lifecycle policy to automatically delete or archive data after a certain period.
That sounds helpful for ensuring compliance with regulations and internal policies.
It is, but you need to make sure your data retention policies are in sync with both your security needs and your compliance obligations.
So you don't accidentally delete something you're legally required to keep, or worse, keep something longer than necessary, exposing it to unnecessary risk.
Exactly. It's a balancing act.
Okay, so data integrity and data retention, two more important considerations. What other S3 security best practices should we have on our radar?
Encryption. We touched on this earlier in the context of ransomware, but it's worth revisiting because it's a fundamental aspect of S3 security.
Encryption, that's where we scramble our data, making it unreadable to anyone who doesn't have the decryption key, right?
Exactly. Encryption protects your data both in transit as it's moving between systems and at rest when it's stored in S3.
So even if someone gains unauthorized access to your S3 buckets, they can't make sense of the data without the decryption key.
Precisely. It adds a crucial layer of protection. And AWS provides a variety of ways to encrypt your data in S3.
Okay, so let's walk through those different encryption options.
Sure. The simplest option is server-side encryption, where AWS handles the encryption keys for you. This is the easiest to implement, but it gives you less control over those keys.
Makes sense. What are the other options?
You can also use client-side encryption, where you manage the encryption keys yourself. This gives you more control, but it's also more complex to set up and manage.
And then there's SSEC, right?
Yeah.
Server-side encryption with customer-provided keys.
That's right. With SSEC, you provide the encryption keys to AWS, giving you more flexibility than standard server-side encryption. But it also means you're responsible for securely managing those keys.
So it's important to choose the encryption method that best aligns with your security needs and your level of comfort with key management.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about understanding the trade-offs and finding the right balance for your specific situation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, everything from ransomware to misconfiguration to data integrity. Any final words of wisdom before we move on to the more practical how-to portion of this deep dive?
I'd say the most important takeaway is that S3 security is not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of assessment, adaptation, and vigilance.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. The threat landscape is constantly shifting, so you need to stay informed about emerging threats and evolving best practices.
And AWS provides a wealth of resources to help you stay in the loop right.
Absolutely. They have a fantastic security blog. Their well-architected framework is a treasure trove of best practices, and there are tons of white papers, webinars, and other resources available.
And don't forget about the community. There are countless forums, blogs, and online communities where security professionals share their knowledge and insights.
Right. And don't be afraid to seek expert advice if you need help configuring your S3 security or developing a comprehensive security strategy.
Great advice. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some specific actions you can take to strengthen your S3 security, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question.
Sounds good. Let's take a moment to reflect on the bigger picture.
We've been talking a lot about technical safeguards, configurations, and tools, but ultimately, S3 security, like all security, is about people.
That's a crucial point. Technology can only take us so far.
Exactly. So the question is, how do we foster a culture of security awareness within our organizations? How do we make security everyone's responsibility?
It's about shifting the mindset, moving away from the idea that security is solely the domain of the IT department.
Right. It's about empowering employees to be the first line of defense, to be proactive in identifying and reporting potential issues.
Exactly. It's about educating employees about the risks, providing them with the tools and knowledge they need to make smart security decisions, and creating a culture where security is seen as everyone's responsibility, not a burden.
And that involves building trust, open communication, and a sense of shared responsibility.
Absolutely. People need to feel comfortable reporting potential issues without fear of reprisal. We need to create an environment where security is everyone's priority.
So as we continue to rely more and more on cloud services like S3, let's remember that technology is only part of the solution. We need to invest in our people, cultivate a strong security culture, and work together to create a safer and more secure digital future.
Well said. Security is a team sport, and we need everyone on board to win.
Excellent point. Now, on that note, let's shift gears from theory to practice in the final part of our deep dive. We'll provide you with some practical tips and actionable steps you can take right now to bolster your S3 security and protect your valuable data. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the importance of a multi-layered security approach. But now, let's get down to brass tacks. What are the concrete steps you can take right now to protect your S3 buckets?
I'd say the absolute first thing you need to do is audit your existing S3 buckets. Think of it as a comprehensive security checkup.
So we're talking about taking inventory, making a
Mhm.
list of all our S3 buckets. Right?
Exactly. And you might be surprised how many you find, especially if you've been using AWS for a while.
Oh, yeah.
Once you have that list, it's time to start digging into the detailed.
What are we looking for specifically during this security audit?
There are several key areas to focus on. First and foremost, you need to scrutinize those access permissions. Are any buckets publicly accessible when they shouldn't be?
Yeah.
Are there users or roles that have more access than they need?
Least privilege, that seems to be the recurring theme here.
It's that important. Every security measure we've discussed hinges on this principle, so really take the time to review your IAM policies, make sure they're as restrictive as possible.
Okay, access permissions, check. What's next on the audit checklist?
Versioning. Is it enabled on all your buckets?
Good point.
If not, make that a top priority.
Yeah.
And MFA Delete, that extra layer of protection that requires multi-factor authentication for critical actions like deleting object versions.
Right.
That should be enabled as well, especially for buckets that contain your most sensitive data.
Okay, so we've checked permissions, versioning, and MFA Delete. Anything else?
Take a look at your lifecycle policies. Are they properly configured? Do they align with your data retention needs and any regulatory requirements you might have?
Lifecycle policies can be powerful tools for managing storage costs and automating data retention. But as we discussed earlier, they can also be exploited by attackers if they're not properly configured.
Exactly. So make sure you understand how they work, review them regularly, and ensure they're aligned with your overall security strategy.
And of course, we can't forget about encryption.
Encryption is absolutely fundamental. Make sure your data is encrypted both in transit and at rest. We talked about the various encryption options available in S3's server-side, client-side, and SSEC. Choose the method that makes sense for your specific needs and security posture.
All right, so we've audited our buckets, tightened up permissions, enabled versioning, MFA Delete, reviewed our lifecycle policies, and ensured our data is encrypted. What's next on our action plan?
It's time to tackle those backups.
Our trusty seatbelts, as we called them earlier.
Exactly. If you haven't already, set up a dedicated AWS account specifically for storing your backups. This adds an extra layer of separation and security, making it much harder for attackers to compromise both your primary data and your backups.
And then automate those backups. No more relying on manual processes or hoping someone remembers to run them.
Automation is key. Set it up so your backups happen regularly and consistently without any human intervention. And whatever you do, don't forget to test those backups.
Right. It's one thing to have backups, but you need to make sure they actually work, that you can restore your data from them if you need to.
Exactly. Think of it as a fire drill for your data. You need to practice the recovery process to make sure you can do it quickly and efficiently when it really matters.
And while we're on the topic of backups and recovery, let's talk about disaster recovery planning. What happens if an entire AWS region goes down?
That's where cross-region replication becomes a real lifesaver. Having your data mirrored in another region means that even if one region experiences a major outage, your data will still be accessible.
But we saw in that biotech startup example that even replication settings can be vulnerable to attack.
That's true. So make sure you secure your replication settings just like you secure everything else. review the permissions, enable MFA Delete where appropriate, and monitor for any suspicious activity.
Okay, so we've got our security bases covered, our backups are in place, and we have a disaster recovery plan. What about ongoing maintenance? What can we do to ensure our S3 security stays strong over time?
Monitoring is absolutely crucial. You need to keep a watchful eye on your S3 environment to detect any suspicious activity or potential issues.
So we're talking about proactively using tools like CloudTrail and GuardDuty.
Exactly. CloudTrail gives you that audit trail of API activity, allowing you to track down any unauthorized access attempts or suspicious changes. And GuardDuty acts as your intelligent security watchdog, analyzing your account activity for any signs of malicious behavior.
And it's not enough to just set up these monitoring tools and forget about them. We need to actively review the logs and alerts they generate.
Exactly. It's like being a detective looking for those subtle clues that something might be amiss. Early detection can make all the difference when it comes to containing a security incident and minimizing its impact.
Okay, so monitoring, vigilance, and proactive threat detection, all essential parts of a robust S3 security strategy. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up this deep dive?
I'd reiterate that S3 security, like all aspects of cybersecurity, is an ongoing journey. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so you need to stay informed, adapt your strategies, and constantly learn and improve.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. We need to stay vigilant, stay curious, and stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of community and collaboration. There are so many resources available to help you: security blogs, forums, online communities, and of course, security professionals you can consult with. Don't be afraid to reach out for help or advice when you need it.
That's great advice. So to sum it all up for our listeners today, audit those S3 buckets, lock down permissions, enable those key security features like versioning and MFA Delete, don't skimp on your backups, have a solid disaster recovery plan in place, and remember to monitor, monitor, monitor.
And never forget that security is a shared responsibility. It's not just the IT department's job. Everyone within an organization has a role to play in protecting sensitive data. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe out there in the cloud.
That concludes our deep dive into S3 buckets and ransomware. We hope you found this episode informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is your best defense. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.